1, 2, there's 3, oh, 4, and 5. Yeah. Call that good. All right, here we go. Do you know which country experienced the most death and turmoil in the 20th century? You might say it was Russia in the hands of Joseph Stalin. You might say it was Germany in the hands of Adolf Hitler. But what you might not know is that China in the 21st century or 20th century in the hands of Mao Zedong might have bested them both. According to the Washington Post, new numbers for deaths from conflicts in China could reach close to 80 million people in the 20th century. Today, I'll address the conflicts surrounding China during World War II and beyond, and how they affected innocent people and the world we see today. I'm a Homeland Security Emergency Management major with an interest in counterterrorism. As I was doing research for a paper on global terrorism, I came across Mao Zedong in the Chinese Revolution. I was shocked at some of the events that I discovered. I'd like to share some of my findings with you today. The Chinese went through struggles of constant warfare and instability throughout the 20th century. This led to unbelievable casualties and loss of quality of life for the Chinese people. In order to understand what happened in China, we must first look at two pre-World War II events. The first was the first Sino-Japanese conflict. In the 1890s, the Qing dynasty still ruled in China, and Japan was growing in power. Both countries had a presence and a desire to control the Korean peninsula. Japan, unwilling to give up their Korean influence, waged a 6-month conflict against China. Japan's more modernized army easily won the dispute, leading to the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. This conflict also led to the fall of the last dynasty in Chinese history. After this conflict, power in China was up for grabs, which leads us to the second pre-war conflict, the Chinese Revolution. This conflict began in 1911, would last through 2 world wars, and end in 1949. After the fall of the Qing dynasty, a reform in China began by 2 opposing parties. One was the Chinese Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek. The other was the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. The larger and more conventional nationalist army engaged in 4 separate encirclement campaigns to try and trap Mao Zedong's guerrilla forces. On the 5th campaign, Chiang raised a huge force and successfully surrounded the communist troops. Mao was then removed from power, and a new leadership employed a more conventional Red Army, which was promptly defeated. With defeat imminent, the communist forces decided to break out of the encirclement at the weakest spots, and thus what is known as the Long March began in 1934. According to History.com, the retreating forces consisted of 85,000 personnel and troops. The retreat lasted almost a year, and by some estimates, only 8,000 marchers had survived the journey, which covered more than 4,000 miles, 28 rivers, and 18 mountain ranges. It wasn't a total loss, however. Once the march ended and the communists were met by reinforcements, Mao Zedong again rose to be the primary military and political leader of the Communist Party. Mao gained influence and recruits by spreading the legend of the Long March and announcing that he was going to address the growing threat that was Japan. With the rise of Axis powers in the 1930s, both Chinese forces ceased fire to address the invading Japanese. The second Sino-Japanese conflict occurred just before the start of World War II. Japan had just invaded Manchuria both for its raw materials and as a spearhead for its coming Asian conquest. The 2 Chinese militaries struggled against the Japanese aggression and were driven inland. Then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and with foreign aid and the U.S. War in the Pacific, they were able to gain a foothold against the Japanese forces. Too many things happened in the fighting to address, but I wanted to point out a few things that I thought were important. In one instance, the Japanese took Nanking, the current capital of China. According to Gus Martin's textbook on global terrorism, the Japanese general Matsui Iwane wanted to break the Chinese spirit. He then ordered what would be known as the Rape of Nanking. The Japanese butchered an estimated 200,000 Chinese POWs and civilians and raped at least 20,000 women, many of whom were mutilated and killed in the process. The terror, however, was not limited to one side. Martin also notes one instance where the Japanese were advancing quickly up the Yellow River in central China. Chinese General Chiang Kai-shek, feeling the pressure, ordered the destruction of an important dam upstream. An estimated 1 million Chinese civilians died within days from the flooding, and another 3 million became refugees. Chiang knew what the consequences of breaking the dam would be, but he determined that the benefits outweighed the costs. Yes, the flood successfully stalled the Japanese army, maybe even saving them from defeat, but did the ends really justify the means? World War II cost the Chinese 4 million military personnel and about 16 million civilians, an unacceptable ratio. After the war ended, most of the world was at peace, besides Chinese, who promptly went back to fighting each other. The Nationalist Army was severely depleted due to their conventional warfare style and their main fighting role against Japanese. The Communist forces were better off due to their guerrilla war strategy. This led to the quick defeat of the Nationalist Army, and more suffering would ensue. Two political movements by Mao Zedong wreaked havoc on the Chinese people. The first was his Great Leap Forward program in 1958. Mao intended on reorganizing China's economy from a more agricultural focus to a more industrialized one. This failed due to two reasons: poor implementation and the fact that Mao wanted this done in an approximately 5-year span. To put that in perspective, the American Industrial Revolution took almost 40 years to come into fruition. China's economy therefore crashed. It's estimated that about 20 million people starved to death in a 3-year span. The second movement was the Cultural Revolution. According to Martin, it lasted 3.5 years from 1966 to 1969. Mao mobilized millions of young supporters called the Red Guard, who waged a purge on what he called the four olds: old customs, old culture, old ideas, and old habits. This was a campaign of terror and intimidation against Mao's opposition. Some 1.5 million people were killed, and millions more, again, were refugees. Looking back, we must acknowledge what China and the rest of East Asia went through during this time. Leaders of people cannot allow such disregard for innocent lives. Many countries were guilty of this in this era, and that is why history must be our greatest teacher. From this specific history, we must learn that the well-being of innocents is of the highest importance, and also the quote-unquote good guys never trade lives for victories. I'll leave you with a quote from Ernest Hemingway. Never think that war, no matter how necessary nor justified, is not a crime.